In this video, I'm going to go over the basics of weaving and specifically band weaving. Hi, my name is Dana Harris Seeger, and this is My Baltic Handmade Life. I have become really enamored with skinny woven textiles, and being a Baltic American, it is part of my heritage to have woven belts, woven straps, and their patterns are strongly tied to my cultural heritage. So I've really gotten into these woven bands, and I am really excited to share this really basic starting step one of how to weave a woven band. And it's a warp facing band, which means that on the loom, when you're weaving, you have the warp, which is the vertical threads, and you have the weft, which goes back and forth on the shuttle. And with these types of bands, you have what's called warp facing. So the vertical threads are what you actually see primarily. So that's what makes the design. So these are some of the types of bands that I've woven, and these are mostly woven out of cotton yarn, and you can finish the edges in a variety of ways. You can use them for a variety of purposes. I've made some for my kids. They wanted little headbands. You can make them and use them as belts. Or straps of any kind. They're very sturdy and durable, and you can see the multitude of designs that you can make. It's really, really fun. Pretty much every culture has a woven band of some type, and there are different ways to weave them. I am going to kind of take you through the Baltic method. That's my heritage. So there's different ways of setting up your warps, different ways of setting up your patterns, and I'm going to specifically talk about the Baltic type. All right, so here we are with our weaving materials. We've got our loom, which we'll talk about more in detail. We've got several types of yarn or thread or string. You can use wool yarn. A lot of traditional Baltic belts and straps use wool. It is a little bit more stretchy. You can get some that's twisted so that it doesn't have a lot of stretch, but in general it has more spring than, say, cotton. And this is a mercerized cotton, and you can see that when I tighten it, it just doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't stretch at all, which is really nice for straps that you want to be really sturdy. So here you can kind of see the difference up close between the cotton thread or yarn and the wool. The wool's a lot fuzzier and stretchier. So you can beat these, we'll talk about that later, but you can beat the cotton a lot harder than you can the wool. It'll take a lot more kind of rigorous working. So I think it's easier for a beginner to use the cotton. It's also a little slipperier as you're going back and forth with the shuttle and beating and threading your heddle. I feel like cotton has a little bit more forgiveness than the wool. So if you're just starting out, I would suggest getting and using some cotton, like mercerized cotton yarn, and then graduate to wool if you so desire. Also, one thing about wool, unless you get the superwash kind, if you were going to wear this as a belt or an element of a garment, then, and you wanted to wash it, then you have to be careful about the wool felting and or shrinking, whereas the cotton shouldn't do that. Just toss that in the washing machine. So these were all woven with the cotton. Comes in all kinds of different colors and thicknesses, so the different weights. I would look for some either fingering weight if you're used to knitting, or if you know anything about the different gauges and weights of yarn. Fingering is one of the thinnest. Lace weight is really thin, but this is fingering wool and cotton. And you can also get sport weight, which is a little bit thicker, and DK, which is even thicker. If you get worsted weight, or if you have worsted weight, that's really thick, and you might end up getting like a really thick and having it a little bit harder to handle. But when we create our patterns with the Baltic weavings, generally, if you want the pattern threads to be kind of raised up and more prominent, then we'll often double the thickness of the yarn. So if you had some that was, say, a DK or a worsted weight, you could definitely use that for the pattern yarns. And this is also a linen thread, which works really well. Again, it doesn't really have a give to it, so it's really good for the weft, the one that goes back and forth, left to right, weft, left. So that's the one that you really only see, and I'll zoom in on this, but you really only see the weft occasionally in the kind of open areas. And then of course in the fringe, if you choose to do that, you'll see it and along the edge. So because the weft goes back and forth, left and right, it will you'll see it on the edge because it kind of overlaps that edge. So whatever color your weft is, that's probably the color that I would generally use for my background. These both use like kind of a cream or a white. This one uses a bluish, and the weft, you can see that it creates sort of like another color within that pattern. So if I wanted to avoid that, then I would use same color weft, say yellow, that this background pattern was. But then I would have like a border along here that was like a yellow and blue alternating border. So now you can kind of see the difference closer up of how the weft makes these little sort of bumps. And if it's the same color as the background, the ground yarn or thread, then you hardly notice it. It kind of just disappears. But if it's contrasting and it's again a different color than that background, so I've got a sort of a blue border, and then the weft is blue as well, so that the border seems solid. But then in the middle, you can kind of see how that blue creates its own pattern, where you can see that intersecting with the background. So because you weave this way, the weft is going back and forth, and it creates that kind of ridge on both sides, depending on whether the threads are laying on top or underneath. So you can totally play around and create different looks depending on the pattern threads that you choose, whether it's lighter on dark background or dark pattern on a lighter background. And the borders, you can choose to include borders if you want. Play around with those and the different colors of the weft. So now we'll talk about the different materials that you need besides the yarn. That's the most important part of the loom, and other things that you need to get started. So we've talked about some of the components of the straps. We've talked about our yarns. Now let's talk about some materials that you need for the actual weaving. So there's different types of looms. There's for making straps. There's a back strap loom, which is really, really simple. You actually wrap it around your back strap, and then there's some sort of anchor, like on a table or a chair or a stake, and that's what your end yarns are tied to, so you can control that tension that you're weaving with. This type of loom is just a narrow band loom. It's got an adjuster here so that as you're weaving, I'll show you how to set this all up, of course, but this gets, all your ends get slipped down here, and then the tension, so you adjust this, and you tighten these wing nuts, and that keeps the tension, and all of your excess yarn gets wrapped around this, that then slides into here. And we'll go through that whole setup. And then you're just weaving back and forth. So it's narrow band because you can't really weave much wider than this. And depending on the heddle that you're using, this is a rigid heddle, and it has 31 slots. So you can use a total of 31 threads, which is what this is. So even though this is about, I don't know, 3 inches wide, the band that you wind up weaving is only about 1 inch. And that's because, like we said before, it's warp facing. So you're taking all these yarns or threads, spreading them out through those holes. Each one is in a separate hole. And then you're pulling them tight so that you only see the top layer. So essentially you have 2 layers of the warp threads that kind of lay on top, and then the weft that goes in between. And that's why you can kind of sometimes see the weft, but for the most part, these pattern threads lay on top. And so they're either going up or they're going down below. So you're really cinching it in, and you're only seeing like 1/3 of all the yarns that you've got. And that's important because in a lot of other weft-facing looms and weaving, you don't cinch it in as much, but it's also not as durable and strong because this essentially has 3 layers. So this is the narrow band loom. This is the heddle. And like I mentioned before, each thread goes into either a long slot or a little hole. And it's designed so that the yarns can either stay stationary or they can slide up and down the slots. So you're raising or lowering, and they either go up or they go down. So you're creating a different shed each time. And the shed is that space in between the threads, that open space that you then insert the weft through. So you'll need your shuttle, which is what carries the weft through the shed. This is just a simple shuttle. It's a piece of wood with a couple of notches. You can get or make shuttles that have kind of a beating edge, like a little wedge that you can beat with the shuttle. Or you can just use this, but the problem with this is that it's not very pointy, so you're not going to get a really tight beat as you're shoving those weft threads down onto each other. And that's, again, essential too for getting a really nice tight strap. So the other thing that you need for this type of Baltic weaving is something to create and pick up those pattern threads. So this particular piece has 7 pattern threads. It's got a middle green one, and it's got 3 reds on either side. And again, you can kind of see how they're raised up and doubled. So the pattern threads go in the middle. So they'll go obviously in the middle of the heddle. And then there's border threads that go on the edges. And you can choose to make your border threads a different color. You can make it the same color as the pattern threads. You can make it the same color as the background. It's really up to you. So, but that's how they go through there. And in order to pick up the pattern and create the look, you need some sort of stick to pick up the threads, the correct threads, or push down the threads. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could be something like a double-pointed knitting needle. Something that's a little bit pointy is helpful because you're going to insert it into the threads and then either push down or pick up as you go along. So I like to have it a little bit wider than the heddle so that I can get it all the way across without having to kind of pull and do some awkward stuff. So double pointed needle works. You can get shuttles that have a little pointy end that act as pickup sticks. You can also use something that you find laying around the house. So this was from a toy. It was like a nutcracker toy that was just the perfect shape. It even has a nice little wedge that I can use to beat. So I appropriated it and am using it as my pickup stick / beater. Another thing that these double pointed needles are good for is tension. So when you start out, I'll show you when you thread your warp, you want to make sure that the tension is nice and tight, and inserting a couple of pencils or little mini dowels or double pointed needles and alternating sheds is really good for tension. So having those on hand is nice. And then obviously some scissors is good because you'll be cutting all these lengths of yarn, and you'll need a nice little pair of scissors. They could be anything that cuts fabric really well. So now that you know kind of the basic materials, we can move on to actually picking our colors and threading our heddle.